One of the challenges we have in safety and operations is understanding why people do what they do, right? Particularly when they do things that don't make sense to us, that seem silly or dumb or, you know, just outright bizarre. So I wanted to put out a short video and maybe help us understand some of that. Maybe we can understand some of these principles of human performance. To help us do that, let's watch a short video and then see what we can learn from it.
Go. This is Pinky. He's a male cat, domestic short hair. He's available for adoption. He's pet of the week, Placer County Animal Shelter. He's a very loving cat.
Hang on to us, please. Oh, yeah. Pinky.
Pinky.
Pinky. Whoa. Whoa, whoa, whoa.
Well, we got a wildcat on our hands. Pinky, settle down, bud. Careful, Cole. Careful. Why don't I get a catch pole? Somebody get a catch pole.
Oh. Pinky.
Just set it over.
No.
Get a catch pole.
You catch our pole to get him?
Yeah, because I'm not going to grab him. Oh-ho. Dude.
Watch it cut us in the... Just disconnect us from the deck. You got him back?
Excuse my language.
So, yeah, there's a lot there, right? So it's easy to look at videos like this or other situations and think, man, how could you be so stupid, right? I mean, obviously the cat did not want to be held, and you got bit in the butt for it, right? But let's see if we can dive a little bit deeper. And I think one of the tools that can really help us understand what's going on in this video and maybe in our workplaces comes from ICAO, the International Civil Aviation Organization. They recently released a document that's pretty interesting. It's actually a manual on human performance for regulators. And in it, I mean, most of us aren't regulators. If you're a regulator, it's definitely worth your time. But the first few chapters are pretty interesting. And in it, they have some principles of human performance that I think could be useful for us. So the first one is people's performance is shaped by their capabilities and limitations. So, I mean, that just makes sense, right? None of us are perfect, right? We all have things that we're really good at and some things that we're not as good at. And that's going to shape what we do, right? An easy example of that is paying attention, right? We can only pay attention to one thing at a time, right? We know that's a limitation we have. And so if you have a job that requires people to pay attention to more than one thing at a time, that's not going to work, right? So we can expect failure there. Secondly, people interpret situations differently and perform in ways that make sense to them. Again, that makes sense, right? We're all different. So we go into a situation and we're going to interpret what's going on based upon what makes sense to us, right? So myself, I'm a safety professional by training. So I'm going to go into things and I'm going to see things with that perspective, but also from a perspective of my background, my education. And you're going to do the same. That may be different than mine because you're different than me, right? And everybody's like that. They're going to go into a situation, they're going to see things from a perspective that makes sense to them. This second one's sort of the essence of what we call local rationality, right? The idea that people do things that make sense to them in the moment. Thirdly, people adapt to meet the demands of a complex, dynamic work environment. Right? So work is messy. Situations change constantly, right? It's not always easy to know what's going on. We have goal conflicts. We have resources that are never as much as we'd like them to be. And we have uncertainty. Things are changing, right? And so people have to adjust in order to meet the demands. Sometimes, the adjustments are small and, kind of negligible. Sometimes they're dramatic, right? Like a lot of people during the pandemic and afterwards are adjusting to new versions of normal, right? We're doing this in real time. But this is just an exaggerated version of what happens almost every day in our workplaces. And in the process of meeting these demands of the work environment, this leads us to the fourth point, that people assess risks and make trade-offs, right? And because as we're trying to balance competing goals without enough resources in an environment where things are changing and we're not always sure what's coming next. We sometimes have to make, trade-offs between different things because we can't do everything. We don't have time to do everything. We don't have enough money to do everything. We don't have enough people. We don't have enough, you name it, right? This requires risk-taking, right? We don't have the ability to always, for example, test the chair we're sitting in to make sure it's structurally sound before we sit in it, or test the coffee that we drink to make sure it's not poisoned. We don't have the ability to do that in all situations, so we decide, okay, that's a risk we're going to take. And that's just an example of what we do all the time. And then finally, people's performance is influenced by working with other people, technology, and the environment. As we go into situations, decide what risks we're going to take and what trade-offs we have to make, that's going to be influenced by who's around us, what's around us, what capabilities we think we have based upon those things. Easy examples of this. Think about how you behave in a restaurant versus in your home versus at your workplace versus in a church versus at a government building versus just on the street, right? Versus on a beach. The ways we act, the things that are expected of us, the norms and patterns of behavior are going to change, sometimes subtly, sometimes in dramatic ways. And that's going to change how you act in that moment. So let's look at how these principles of human performance can maybe help us understand what's going on in the video we saw with Pinky, right? So put yourself into the position of this person, right? This guy, right? So he's trying to film a commercial, right? To have people adopt this cat, right? Because it was a stray cat that was found, right? So as he's doing that, he's trying to pay attention, focus on the camera like I'm doing right now, right? And we said earlier that attention is a finite resource. It's something you can only pay attention to one thing at a time. So again, number one, people's performance is shaped by their capabilities and limitations. So as he's paying attention to the camera in front of him, his attention can't be on the cat in that moment. So as the cat's becoming restless, he's not as focused on that because he's trying to pay attention to what's in front of him, the task that's ahead of him. Secondly, people interpret situations differently and perform in ways that make sense to them, right? If we look at that human performance principle and we say, okay, what would make sense for him in that moment? Well, again, he's filming a commercial, right? And so how would he interpret this situation? Well, a couple things I think we can just kind of guess at that would help us understand his behavior. Number one, so he's got a badge. He's what we would call an animal control officer. So I assume this is not the first time he's held a cat. So he probably interprets the situation as, okay, I am in control of this situation, right? I have the ability to manage this cat. It's probably not the first time he's held a cat, for example. He even seems to suggest that he has knowledge of Pinky and understands Pinky. Pinky's a loving cat, he says, right? So he's, his interpretation is, okay, this is a situation I can manage. I have control of. I don't need to focus on Pinky or do anything different. I can pay attention to what's in front of me, right? And then as Pinky kind of goes wild, right? Why would it make sense for him to hold on to the leash, right? Because sometimes people will say, well, if he just let go, he wouldn't have gotten bit. Why would that make sense? Well, again, he's interpreting the situation as, okay, what am I trying to do here? I'm trying to get this cat adopted. If I release the leash and the cat runs away, you can't adopt a cat that you don't have, right? So he's got to hold on to it, right? And this sort of leads us to the third point, that people adapt to meet the demands of a complex, dynamic work environment, right? And again, think about the complexity of that situation. The key question to ask is, cats wrestle and, they get, restless sometimes, right? When you're holding them. Most of the time that's not a problem. The cat's not going to flip out like Pinky did. But sometimes, obviously, they do. How do you know the difference beforehand? It's easy to know afterwards, but how do you know beforehand? So he's adapting his behavior to meet the demands of the work environment based on what he knows. And this goes back to the second point, right? He's adjusting his performance based upon the situation that he's seeing in front of him, but that situation is inherently uncertain and dynamic. right? He does not know what Pinky's going to do next because he can't read cats' minds, right? He may be really good at his job, but he's not that good, which this leads to the fourth point, right? So he has to assess the risk of the situation and make a trade-off, right? And the trade-off in this case was, okay, I've got a 30-second video I've got to film here, a commercial. I'm just going to be holding the cat for that long. If it wrestles a little bit, if it's unhappy that I'm holding it, it's only 30 seconds, and what's the worst that can happen, right? And so he's making a trade-off here. If, maybe in a different situation and in a different environment, he would assess the risk differently. And this leads us to our final point, that people's performance is influenced by working with other people, technology, and the environment. Everything that he's doing is shaped by the reality that he is in front of a camera, right? Which you can imagine, going back to even to the first point, that's going to increase levels of tension, levels of stress, even his focus in that moment. Right? It's gonna influence how he's acting, how he's thinking, how he's making sense of the situation. And that's the interesting thing about these human performance principles, is that they work together. And the value of this, when we dive in deeper and we apply these principles to start to understand what's driving people's behaviors, is it shifts our perspective. So, like this picture here, right, which you can see in a couple different ways. When you look at human performance, what you look for changes what you see, and that changes what you do. If when you look at people's actions and decisions and you see it just as a product of them, and whether they're smart or stupid and make good choices or bad choices, then you're going to focus on that, and you're going to make your interventions about fixing the individuals. But if you take the kind of principles of human performance and expand what you see to see that, no, people are responding to what's going on around them, right? They're responding to their capabilities and limitations. They're responding to the dynamics of the work environment. They're assessing the risks and actively managing those things. Then what you do shifts, right? You start to think about, how can I make it easier for them to do the right thing, right? How can I make it harder to do the things that shouldn't happen? And how can I make it so that, when people come against their limitations and deal with that complex work environment, that we don't get the bad outcomes that we want, right? So I hope this video was useful in kind of helping you improve your human performance programs and safety programs. If you have questions, comments, or anything else, feel free to reach out.